The morning Caleb Merritt turned 18, nobody threw him a party. There was no cake on the counter, no balloons tied to the mailbox post, no friends gathered around a kitchen table. There was only the sound of his grandmother moving through the dark house before the sun came up, the soft click of the cabinet above the sink, the small mechanical beep of a glucose monitor reading the numbers wrong again. Caleb lay in bed for 30 seconds after he heard that beep. He counted the seconds the way he always did, the way he'd been doing since he was 12 years old and first understood what those numbers meant. Then he got up. The hallway was narrow. The floorboard outside his door creaked in the same place it had creaked for the 6 years they'd lived in this house, and he stepped over it out of habit, the way you step over a crack in the sidewalk. Muscle memory, the kind that builds itself quietly over years of not wanting to add another sound to a house that already had too many hard ones. Dorothea Merritt was at the kitchen counter with her back to him. She was wearing her blue house dress and her reading glasses, and she had the testing kit spread out in front of her, the way a surgeon lays out instruments. Precise, deliberate. She wrote the number in her notebook without saying a word about it. She had been writing numbers in that notebook for 3 years. Some mornings the numbers were acceptable. Some mornings they were not. This was one of the mornings they were not. And she absorbed that information the same way she absorbed most hard things, quietly, without drama, with a kind of dignity that Caleb had spent his entire life trying to understand and had never fully been able to name. He kissed the top of her head on the way to the stove. She smelled like the same hand lotion she'd used since before he was born. He didn't know the brand. He just knew the smell. It meant she was there. It meant the house was standing. Some mornings that was the only math that mattered. The oven door wouldn't close all the way. It had been drifting for 2 weeks, the hinge wearing loose from years of use, and every time Dot baked anything, she had to hold it shut with a dish towel folded against the handle. Caleb had been meaning to fix it. He'd been meaning to fix it the same way you mean to fix everything, when the money runs a little short and the hours run a little long, and there are always 3 things ahead of the thing you're meaning to do. He pulled the screwdriver from his back pocket. He always carried a screwdriver. He carried a small adjustable wrench too, and a flathead on a key ring, and a box cutter he'd had since Walt Briggs gave it to him on his first day of work 3 years ago, and said, "Boy, a man without a tool in his hand is a man waiting for someone else to solve his problem." He tightened the hinge in under a minute. The door swung clean and held. Dot watched him without turning around. She had eyes in the back of her head. She'd always had them. "You don't have to fix everything in this house, baby. Somebody has to." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. Then she poured him coffee without asking and set it at the edge of the counter where he could reach it without interrupting her work. He counted what was in his pocket on the way to the coat rack. $31 and some change. His next paycheck from Briggs Auto was 4 days out. The medical bill on the kitchen counter, the one tucked under the fruit bowl, like maybe if you couldn't see it clearly it wasn't entirely real, was $412. And that was after the partial coverage from the county assistance program, and the insulin for next month was going to run another 60 on top of that. He stood at the kitchen door and looked at the rent jar on the counter. It was a wide-mouthed mason jar that had once held peach preserves his great-aunt sent up from Georgia, and they kept folded bills in it the way other families kept spare keys. He looked at the jar. He looked over his shoulder. Dot had her back to him. He folded the last 20 from his wallet and slid it down between the other bills. He was reaching for his jacket when she said his name. "Caleb." He stopped. She was in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed over her house dress. She wasn't angry. He could read the difference between Dot angry and Dot something else, and this was something else. This was the expression she wore when she had something important to say and had already decided exactly how she was going to say it, which meant there was no use trying to talk around it. "Bring that back." He turned. He walked to the jar. He took the 20 out and held it in his palm without saying anything. She crossed the kitchen slowly and stood in front of him and put her hand on the side of his face the way she had when he was small. Her hands were dry and warm and had the steadiness of someone who had held things together for a very long time. "Listen to me one time." She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. Our family, from your great-grandfather down through every person who came before you, we don't take what we didn't earn, and we do not take from our own children to pay for ourselves. You hear me? Yes, ma'am. That medical bill is mine. The insulin is mine. The numbers in that notebook are mine to manage, not yours to carry. She paused. Her thumb moved once against his cheekbone. I don't need you to save me, Caleb. I need you to become the man I'm already proud of, so that when I'm gone, I can say I watched that happen with my own eyes. That is how you pay me back. That is the only currency I'm accepting. You understand? He nodded. He put the 20 back in his wallet. He kissed her cheek. He put his jacket on and walked out into the morning. The bike chain had snapped 2 weeks ago. He hadn't had money to replace it yet and hadn't had time to look for one at the salvage on Clement Street, so he walked. 22 blocks from the house on Ardmore to Briggs Auto on Maple, which was not a long walk in October, but was a significant one in late July when the heat came up off the sidewalk before 8 in the morning and sat on your shoulders the whole way. He walked it anyway. He walked it the way he walked most things, steadily, without complaint, with his eyes forward and his hands loose at his sides. A woman at the corner gas station near the overpass looked up from restocking the cooler as he passed the window. She came to the door. You work here, son? No, ma'am, just passing through. She didn't apologize. She went back inside. He kept walking. 2 blocks further, a patrol car came up alongside him at the same pace he was walking. The officer in the passenger seat looked him over from behind his sunglasses for a long enough moment that Caleb counted it. Looked at his jacket, his backpack, his hands. Then the car drifted forward and turned at the corner and was gone. Caleb's face did not change. His pace did not change. He had been navigating this since he was 12 years old. The particular experience of being assessed before he had done anything, of having his character weighed by people who did not know his name or his grandmother's name, or the fact that he had woken up before sunrise and fixed a hinge before he had even had his coffee. He had learned to move through it without burning. The burning didn't help anything. The burning was expensive, and he couldn't afford it. 3 blocks from Briggs Auto, the heat was already serious. He thought about the book in his backpack. He checked it out from the branch library on Fenwick Avenue for the 3rd time this year. Modern Custom Builders of Visual History. It was a large format book heavy with photographs that took up entire pages. He dog-eared a page in the first week of owning his first library card and had been returning to it ever since, sometimes just to look the way you look at something you want to understand fully and keep discovering you haven't yet. The photograph was a full-page spread, a motorcycle against a white studio backdrop, cherry red 1959, a panhead engine sitting inside a custom frame with lines so clean they looked drawn rather than fabricated. The tank had pinstripe work on it that the caption described as hand-laid, applied in 3 stages over a period of 2 weeks, each line pulled with a single hairbrush, and a steadiness that came not from talent, but from practice, so deep it had become instinct. The caption beneath the photograph read, Raymond Iron Ray Hargrove. Hargrove Custom Works, founded 1995. President Iron Circle Chapter. He has built 41 motorcycles by hand. He intends to build 41 more. Caleb had read that caption so many times he could have said it backward. He whispered the names the way some people whisper the names of saints. Hargrove, Whitmore, Delacroix, Callahan. The men who built the machines. The men who understood that a motorcycle was not transportation. It was a statement of principle rendered in steel and chrome, and the particular patience of someone who refused to accept the world as it came and decided to make something better in it. He was still thinking about the photograph when he turned onto Maple and walked through the open bay door of Briggs Auto. Walt Briggs was already under the hood of an old Silverado with a cup of coffee balanced on the air filter housing and a look on his face like the engine had personally insulted him. He was 63 years old, built like a man who had spent his life lifting things that were heavier than they should have been, and he communicated mostly in grunts and silences that varied enough in texture that Caleb had learned to read them the way you read weather. Walt looked up when Caleb came through the door. "You're early." Bus didn't run. "I started early." Walt grunted, which in this context meant something close to all right then, and went back to the Silverado. Caleb pulled on his coveralls and went to the back of the shop where a 1986 BMW R Series sat on a stand waiting for him. It had come in last Thursday. The previous mechanic had looked at it and written a note on the job sheet that said engine C's recommend replacement, which was the kind of note you wrote when you didn't want to find out what was actually wrong. Caleb had looked at it for 20 minutes on Friday and written underneath, "Not C's." Timing chain tension. "Let me run it." Walt had said nothing, which meant go ahead. He worked on the BMW the way he worked on everything. Quietly, without showing off. Taking his time with each connection, thinking through what the machine was trying to tell him before he told it what to do. Engines made sense in a way that a lot of things didn't. They had logic. They had reason. Every problem had a cause, and every cause could be traced backward to its source if you were patient enough and honest enough to keep looking. He liked that about them. He had always liked that about them. Around 10 o'clock, a man in a polo shirt came in off the street with a key fob to a Lexus in a manner that said he expected someone specific to come out of the back to meet him. He looked past Caleb at the counter. He looked past Caleb toward Walt's office. He asked Walt, who was now at the parts desk, whether the mechanic was available. Walt jerked his thumb at Caleb without looking up from his catalog. "He is the mechanic." The man blinked, tried to rearrange his face into something neutral. He mostly succeeded. Caleb nodded at him, polite professional. He asked what was going on with the Lexus. He listened to the answer. He wrote the information on the job sheet in his careful, deliberate handwriting. He did not comment on anything except the car. He had been doing this since he was 15. That particular adjustment, the small recalibration that happened when someone looked at him and saw something other than what he was. He had learned to keep moving through it, the way you keep moving through a door that opens slower than it should, without making the door the point. Lunch break at noon. He sat on the parts crate in the back of the shop, with the library book open across his knees and a peanut butter sandwich from the bag he'd packed before sunrise. The shop was quiet. Walt had gone to the diner on the corner like he did every day at noon without fail. Caleb turned to the dog-eared page. The red panhead looked back at him. He ate his sandwich and looked at the photograph and thought about the lines of the frame and the way the pinstripe work on the tank caught the studio light. He thought about what it would take to do that. What your hands would have to know, what your eyes would have to have seen. He thought about the 41 motorcycles and the intention to build 41 more, and what it meant to have a number like that in your head, to have a direction that specific, that concrete, that entirely your own. The afternoon ran long. A Ford pickup came in at 2 with a transmission issue that turned out to be simpler than it looked, which was almost a pleasure. And a Honda Civic came in at 4 with a noise from the front end that turned out to be more complicated than it looked, which was not a pleasure, but was interesting. And by the time Caleb had both jobs documented and the Civic's suspension disassembled and cataloged on the workbench, it was past 5, and the light through the bay door had gone golden and long. Walt came by on his way to lock up. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the notes on the job sheet. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Good eye on that CV joint." That was the whole of it. Walt picked up his keys and walked to the back to set the alarm. Caleb put his tools away and folded his coveralls and put them on their hook and stood at the open bay door for a moment before he locked it behind him. The walk home was longer in the heat. His arms ached from the Civic's suspension work, and the backpack was heavier with the library book in it, or felt heavier, which was sometimes the same thing. He passed the billboard on the corner of 5th and Ardmore. He passed it twice a week, and he always looked. West Coast Custom Bike Show. Registration open. Entry fee $350. He looked at it. He did the math he always did. He kept walking. On the corner of 9th, Mrs. Aldridge was on her stoop, struggling with 2 brown paper bags and the metal cane she'd had since her hip surgery in the spring. She was 74 years old and had lived on this block since before Caleb was born, and she had always waved to him when he passed rain or sun, and once when he was 16 and having a bad enough week that he'd let it show on his face, she had brought him a plate of cornbread through the chain link without explanation. He crossed the street without thinking. "Let me get those, ma'am." "Oh, Caleb, you don't have to." He took the bags. He carried them up the front steps and set them inside her screen door. He didn't wait for thanks. He waved and kept walking. Behind him, he heard her say something to herself low with a kind of fondness in it. He didn't catch the words. He was already thinking about tomorrow, about the CV joint on the Civic, about the BMW's timing chain, about the medical bill under the fruit bowl, about a cherry red panhead he had never seen in real life and wasn't sure he ever would. He was still thinking about it when he turned off Fifth Street and cut behind the Sunoco station on the shortcut route that saved 3 blocks. He almost didn't take it the shortcut. He almost stayed on Fifth and gone the long way home, the way he sometimes did when his feet were especially tired, and the long way had better shade. He had no reason for the shortcut except habit and a slight heaviness behind his eyes that made 3 blocks feel like something worth saving. He turned behind the Sunoco, and he stopped. It was the motorcycle he saw first, cherry red, sitting at the pump on the near side of the lot with the kickstand down the late afternoon sun, catching the tank and throwing a glare across the pavement that made him squint. Even from 40 feet away, he could see the lines of the frame, the particular curve of the fender, the handmade quality of the chrome work that you couldn't replicate in a factory because factories didn't have patience, only speed. He knew that motorcycle, not because he had seen it before in real life. He had not seen it before in real life. He knew it from a photograph on a dog-eared page in a library book he had read until the spine was soft. The man at the pump had his back to him, wide shoulders under a leather vest covered in patches, the back panel showing the Iron Circle insignia that Caleb also recognized, also from reading, also from paying attention to things that other people his age didn't think were worth paying attention to. White hair close cut, hands that moved on the pump with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been handling machines his entire life. Raymond Hargrove. The thought came through Caleb's mind the way a fact arrives when you know it so well it doesn't need to announce itself. He stood there for 2 full seconds processing the distance between the photograph in the book and the man standing 40 feet away from him in a gas station lot. Then he saw the others. The black Chevy had come in quietly from the other side of the lot and parked against the far curb without Caleb noticing it because he'd been looking at the motorcycle. 5 young men got out. A sixth one came around the front of the car. 2022 dressed for heat and attitude, moving the way a group of young men move when they've already decided on something and are only working out the specifics. Caleb watched them walk toward the pump. The one in front whistled, low, drawn out, the kind of sound that's meant to reduce something to its monetary value. He walked a slow circle around the panhead with his hands in his pockets and his chin up. The others spread out behind him. Raymond Hargrove did not turn around. That stillness should have meant something to them. It didn't. "Hey, old-timer, you lost nursing homes the other way." Hargrove set the pump nozzle back in the cradle. He still did not turn. One of the others kicked the back tire, a short, contemptuous thing. The motorcycle rocked on its stand and steadied. Hargrove's shoulders went tight for half a second and then went still again. The one in front went into the edge of the lot where an old metal toolbox sat rusting near the air pump, housing abandoned half full of rainwater and forgotten things. He reached in and came out with a long pipe wrench. Heavy. The kind that was made for leverage, for torque, for getting purchase on something that didn't want to move. He hefted it. He tapped it against his own palm. Keys, wallet, watch. "Do it slow, old man." Hargrove turned around. His face was not afraid. It was not surprised. It was the face of a man who had seen worse than this in worse places and had developed over the long course of that experience a flatness behind the eyes that came from knowing exactly how these moments went. His voice was low and even. "Walk away, son. You don't want to do this." The one with the wrench laughed. He looked back at the others. "You hear that, boys? Grandpa's giving advice. A young woman with a stroller came around the corner of the station and stopped. She looked at the six of them. She looked at the pipe wrench. She turned the stroller around and went back the way she'd come fast. Inside the station, Caleb could see the clerk through the plate glass. The clerk watched for 10 seconds. Then he moved away from the window toward the back and did not come back. The one they called Brett picked up a plastic patio chair from the stack beside the station door and swung it hard into Hargrove's back. The chair cracked. Hargrove's body folded. He went down to one knee on the broken glass from a bottle someone had smashed earlier, and his breath left him in a single rough sound, controlled, compressed the sound of a man absorbing damage without giving the damage what it wanted. He knelt there. His head was bowed. He was gathering himself. He was 60 years old and alone, and his phone was dead in his vest pocket, and there was nobody in this parking lot who was going to help him. Caleb had taken 2 steps backward without meaning to. His sneaker scraped on the gravel at the lot's edge. A small sound. A nothing sound. One of the others turned first, the one closest to the edge. His eyes found Caleb with the lazy ease of someone who had done this before. Walk away, kid. This ain't your block. This ain't your business. 2 more turned. One of them stepped toward Caleb with the cracked chair still in his hand, moving to put himself between Caleb and Hargrove, making a wall of himself. You deaf too. Same problem as Grandpa. Go home. Tell your mom you saw something scary. Tell her to keep you out of grown folks' business. The one with the pipe wrench didn't even turn his head. He spoke over his shoulder, easy, dismissive, the way you speak to something that doesn't require your full attention. Let him go. He knows how it works. Don't you, boy? Caleb did not answer. He looked past the one with the chair, past the broken glass catching the sun, past the cracked plastic and the spread of boots on the pavement. He looked at Raymond Hargrove on one knee. Their eyes met. Hargrove shook his head, the smallest possible movement. A warning with no sound attached. His eyes said everything the movement didn't. You are 18 years old. You have $31 in your pocket and a grandmother at home and a medical bill under a fruit bowl. Go. Then his voice came out low and cracked and stripped of everything but the truth of it. Please, son, just keep walking. Caleb stood there for 2 full seconds. He was aware of his left hand already closed into a fist. He was aware of his right hand where it rested against the back pocket with the adjustable wrench in it. He was aware of the length of rusted bicycle chain coiled in the dirt beside the dumpster to his left. The kind of chain that some kid had thrown away and that had been lying there long enough that the links had started to scale over with rust, but the steel underneath was still sound. He was aware of what was in him. Not bravery. He didn't think of it as bravery. He thought of it as arithmetic. He had spent his whole life adding things up, the right things on one side and the leaving things on the other. And there had been 100 mornings and 100 corners and 100 moments when the math came out difficult and he had done it anyway and kept walking and told himself that was the right choice. The survivable choice, the choice a reasonable person made. He thought about Dot's hand on his face before sunrise, the steadiness of it, the weight of what she had said. We don't take what we didn't earn, and we do not walk away from what's right. She hadn't said the second part, but she hadn't needed to. It was in every story she had ever told him about every person who had come before him and what they had done when the moment asked them something difficult, and what had happened to the ones who answered correctly and what had happened to the ones who hadn't. He looked at the bicycle chain. He looked at the 6 of them. He looked at Raymond Hargrove, the man from the photograph, the man who had built 41 motorcycles and intended to build 41 more kneeling in broken glass in a gas station parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon in July with nobody coming. He moved. He grabbed the chain with his left hand and the water bottle from his backpack strap with his right, and he threw the bottle hard at the back of the nearest one's head. It caught the side of his ear and bounced, and the man spun, and in the half second that bought him, Caleb was already inside the circle, driving his shoulder hard into the ribs of the one nearest the dumpster, feeling the impact shudder through both of them. hearing the man's breath go out as he staggered. The cracked chair came at his head from the left. He got his forearm up and the plastic split clean through, and the pain ran from his wrist to his shoulder like something electric, and his arm went half numb on contact. He kept moving. You don't stop for pain. Pain is information. Information can wait. He snapped the chain low across the shins of the one coming at him from the right. The man went down sideways, cursing his legs going out from under him in a way that wasn't dignified or theatrical, just sudden and messy and real. Behind him, without a sound, Raymond Hargrove moved. The man who had been kneeling in broken glass for 2 minutes, breathing controlled, saying nothing. Watching everything came up off the pavement like something uncoiling that had been still for a long time by choice rather than necessity. He swept the legs out from under the one standing behind him with a single clean motion, practiced and precise, the kind of technique you don't improvise. The man hit the concrete flat on his back, and all the air left him at once in a wet, involuntary sound. And for the first time, the one still standing saw something on Raymond Hargrove's face that was not fear and had never been fear. It was something older than fear. Something that had been there the whole time underneath the stillness, waiting with exactly as much patience as the moment required. The one with the pipe wrench recovered and came at Caleb with it raised, swinging for the shoulder, and Caleb twisted sideways and took the end of it across the back of his right arm instead of the side of his head. The metal dragged across the muscle, and the skin held, but the burn came through immediately, deep and spreading. He ducked under the follow-through, looped the chain around the man's wrist, and twisted hard. The wrench dropped. The man made a sound and stepped back. Hargrove stepped forward and put himself between Caleb and the four still standing and set his feet. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Boys, walk away while you still can. Something in the air changed. Not a sound and not a movement, but something that happened in the quality of the silence between one moment and the next, a pressure shift, the way the atmosphere changes before a storm moves in and everything goes briefly, completely still. The one with the injured wrist looked at the old man. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the chains still in Caleb's hand. He looked at the three of his crew on the ground. He ran. The others scattered behind him. The Chevy started up fast and wrong and peeled out of the lot in a spray of loose gravel, and then it was gone, and the parking lot was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on 5th Street and the low tick of the Panhead's engine cooling in the heat. Caleb stood still. 1 breath. 2. His knees went. He sat down hard on the curb, and his whole body started shaking at once. A deep internal trembling that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with adrenaline, leaving all at once the way it does when the thing you held yourself together for is finished, and there's nothing left to hold yourself together for. His left forearm was already darkening, purple under the skin spreading from where the chair had connected. His right arm burned from the wrench. His right knee was scraped through the denim of his jeans where he'd gone down on the pavement during the scramble and hadn't noticed in the moment. He noticed now. Raymond Hargrove stood over him. He didn't look at Caleb's face right away. He looked at Caleb's hands, at the grease permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, the mechanic's hands, the hands of someone who knew how things worked and spent their days proving it, the adjustable wrench sitting in the dirt where it had fallen, the library card on the ground where it had slipped from his jacket pocket. Hargrove crouched down. He moved with the deliberateness of a man whose body knew exactly which injuries from which decades were informing his motion. Compensating without comment, still dignified in the way only people who have learned to carry pain without performing it are dignified. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded bandana. Blue worn, soft, clean. He shook it open and wrapped it around Caleb's swelling forearm and tied it with the efficient care of someone who had done this before many times in many parking lots in many different years of his life. As he pulled the knot tight, the sun caught the steel ring on his right hand. A compass face set into a wide band, the needle pointing north, the cardinal directions rendered in small, clean letters around the bezel. Caleb's eyes found it, held there, then moved away. Hargrove noticed. "What's your name, son, Caleb? Why'd you do that?" "Caleb." Caleb looked at his bandaged arm. He thought about the answer for a moment, turned it over, tested its weight. Then he just told the truth. Nobody else was going to. Hargrove looked at him for a long time. The kind of looking that isn't passive. The kind that takes something in and weighs it and files it somewhere it won't be lost. He stood up slowly. His back cracked once and he absorbed it without acknowledgement. He looked at his pan head 20 feet away, untouched exactly where he'd left it, the chrome catching the late afternoon light. He looked back at Caleb on the curb. Kid, you have no idea who you just helped. He reached into his vest. Caleb thought he was reaching for a phone. He wasn't. He pulled out a fold of bills, hundreds thick, easily $3,000 or $4,000. He held it out. Take it. For the arm. Caleb looked at the money. He looked at Hargrove's face. He shook his head once. I'm not going to take money for that, sir. Hargrove moved it forward an inch. His voice shifted softer. For your family, then. Something moved behind Caleb's eyes. Quick, barely visible. Hargrove didn't know about the rent jar, didn't know about the notebook and the numbers that were wrong again this morning, didn't know about the medical bill under the fruit bowl, or about a woman who had put her hand on her grandson's face before sunrise and said, I need you to become the man I'm already proud of. Caleb heard her voice the way you hear something that lives in you, not in memory, not from the outside, but from the place where the things that have shaped you actually live. He shook his head again. I didn't do it for that. Hargrove held the money out for one more second. Then he nodded. He folded it back into his vest. He didn't push again. He just looked at Caleb the way a man looks at something he found in an unexpected place and is still working out the significance of. All right, he said. All right. Caleb pushed himself up from the curb. His left arm hung stiff at his side. He picked up the library card from the ground, brushed the gravel off it, put it back in his jacket. He started to walk past Hargrove toward the road. He passed the panhead. He stopped. He hadn't planned to stop. His legs stopped without consulting him the way the body sometimes does when the mind has been keeping something at arm's length and the body has simply had enough of that. He looked at the tank, the pinstripe work, the hand-laid pattern around the gas cap. The cherry red that wasn't red like paint from a can, it was red like something that had been chosen with care and applied with intention, red that had been decided upon and committed to. The small brass badge on the seat hump, the lines of the frame that he had studied in a photograph for 3 years. He had been looking at this motorcycle his entire working life. He had read the caption 100 times. He had whispered the name to himself in a lunch break, in a shop on a quiet afternoon with a sandwich on his knee, and a dream that felt like it might always be just a photograph. He looked at the tank. He looked at the badge. He looked at Raymond Hargrove. He didn't say anything. He couldn't have put language to what was moving through him in that moment without reducing it to something smaller than it was. Some things are too large for 18 years of words. Hargrove watched him put it together. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He just lifted one corner of his mouth in what was almost a smile and what was entirely a recognition. Caleb swallowed. He turned. He started walking toward the road. Behind him, Hargrove's voice came quiet and even. Son. Caleb stopped. We don't forget. He turned back to ask what that meant, but Hargrove was already pulling his helmet down. The panhead started with a sound that came up through the pavement and through the soles of Caleb's shoes and into his chest, a low rolling thunder that belonged to a different scale than the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday. One nod, kickstand up, and the red motorcycle rolled out of the lot and onto 5th Street and was gone. Caleb stood alone in the empty gas station parking lot with a bandaged arm and the ghost of an engine in his chest. Inside the station, the clerk had come back to the window. He stood there for a moment watching Caleb. He watched Hargrove's taillights disappear around the bend on 5th. He waited until the lot was completely still until Caleb had turned the corner and was gone. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number he had not dialed in several years. He kept his voice low when someone answered. It was him. Yeah, the one from the magazine. Some kid pulled him out. Black kid, skinny, from the east side. Briggs Auto on Maple, I think. He hung up. Caleb got home at 6:40. Dot was at the kitchen table with her notebook and a glass of water. She looked up when he came through the door. She saw the bandana on his left forearm. She saw the dirt on his jeans. She saw the way he was favoring his right side. She set her pen down. Caleb, caught on a fence on the way home. It's fine. She looked at him for a long, slow moment. She did not believe him. He could see her not believing him with perfect clarity. But she was tired and the numbers in her notebook were wrong again, and he was home. She said, "Sit down. Let me see it." He sat. She unwrapped the bandana, looked at the bruise spreading across his forearm, cleaned it with the things from the medicine cabinet, wrapped it again with the gauze. The blue bandana she folded carefully and set on the table beside her pen. She didn't ask again. He didn't offer. That night he lay in his bed and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and listened to the house settle, and his arm throbbed and his shoulder throbbed, and three words moved through him over and over in the dark. We don't forget. We don't forget. We don't forget. He didn't sleep for a long time, and when he did, he dreamed of a cherry-red motorcycle disappearing around a curve in a road he didn't know yet, but somehow felt certain he was going to find. He was back at Briggs Auto by 5:45 the next morning. Walt wasn't in yet. Caleb unlocked the side door with the key Walt had given him 2 years ago, without ceremony, just pressed it into his palm one afternoon and said, "Don't lose it," and went straight to the back where the BMW R Series was waiting. He pulled his coveralls on over the bruise and the gauze and got to work. The arm hurt when he torqued anything. He torqued anyway. He had been awake since 4. The three words had followed him out of sleep and into the dark of the bedroom, and through the ritual of the morning Dot at the counter with her notebook, the 22 blocks that had started to feel less like a commute and more like something he did on purpose. They sat behind everything he did the way a low sound sits behind a room not loud enough to be the thing you're listening to, but too present to be fully ignored. We don't forget. He didn't know what it meant yet. He knew it meant something. He had learned in 18 years of paying close attention to the people around him to tell the difference between words that were said to fill silence and words that were said because they were true and needed saying. And those three words had been neither casual nor decorative. They had been a statement of fact delivered with the precision of someone who did not waste language. He turned a wrench and felt the pain move up his forearm and kept turning. Walt came in at 7 and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Then he poured his coffee and went to his desk, and the day began in the ordinary way that days at Briggs Auto began, which was to say with oil and steel and the particular problem-solving satisfaction of making broken things work again. At 9:10 on his way back from the parts shelf, Caleb noticed the man across the street. He was standing near the laundromat with a newspaper folded in his hands, performing the act of reading it with the careful awkwardness of someone whose attention was not on the page at all. He was in his 40s, heavy-set, wearing a dark jacket too warm for July. He had been there when Caleb arrived. He was still there now. Caleb went back to his workbench. He did not say anything to Walt. He did not change his pace or his posture. He filed the information the way he filed most things that required patience carefully in the back of his mind where it would wait for context. The day moved through itself. A transmission job, a brake line, a young woman with a Subaru, and a knocking sound in the left rear that turned out to be a loose heat shield. Caleb fixed all three and documented them in his careful handwriting on the job sheets and ate his lunch in the back with the library book on his knees, though he didn't turn to the dog-eared page. He sat with it closed on his lap and ate his sandwich and thought. The man with the newspaper was gone when he checked at noon. He came back at 2:30. Caleb watched him from the angle of the bay mirror without turning his head. The man wasn't threatening. He wasn't moving toward the shop. He was just watching with the patient attention of someone who had been asked to observe and was doing his job. Caleb went back to the heat shield. The information settled into him slowly like sediment. Someone had sent this man. Someone had sent him here to the street to watch Caleb Merritt work on a Subaru on a Wednesday afternoon in July. Someone had found out in less than 24 hours where Caleb worked and what his hours were and which bay he worked in. That kind of information gathering required resources. It required networks. It required the kind of organized attention that belonged to people who were accustomed to knowing things about the world they lived in. Three words moved through him again. We don't forget. He locked up the side door at 5:50 and walked home the long way, not out of caution, but out of a need to think inside the movement of his own legs on familiar ground. He passed the billboard on 5th and Ardmore and looked at it the way he always looked at it. West Coast Custom Bike Show, $350. He did his math. He kept walking. Dot had made soup. The kitchen smelled like it when he came through the door, and he stood in the hallway for a moment just breathing it in, the smell of the house and the soup, and the low sound of the evening news from the small television in the living room. And he felt the day leave his shoulders in a long, slow exhale. He told her about his day. Not all of it. The Subaru, the brake line, Walt's grunt of approval when the BMW finally turned over clean at 4 o'clock after 3 days of careful work. She listened the way she always listened, with full attention, asking the occasional question, her eyes on her soup bowl, tracking every word. He did not tell her about the man with the newspaper. That night he lay awake again, and this time he didn't try to force sleep. He looked at the ceiling, and he thought about Raymond Hargrove on one knee in broken glass, and the way the man had come off that pavement, and the way the six of them had run. And he thought about the library card on the ground, and the compass ring, and a bandana tied with practiced hands, and three words that kept arriving in him with the insistence of something that wasn't finished yet. He was still awake at midnight. He was asleep by 12:15. He was at the shop by 5:45 again. He did not see the man with the newspaper on Thursday. He saw a different man on Friday, a woman on Saturday morning. Both of them with the same careful performance of inattention, both of them gone by noon. By Saturday afternoon, he had stopped filing the information in the back of his mind and had moved it to the front. Something was coming. He didn't know its shape yet. He went to work and came home and ate Dot's food and lay in the dark and waited for it to arrive. It arrived on Thursday of the following week. He was under the front end of a lifted F-25, his back on the creeper, working a stuck caliper bolt that had been rusted in place since the previous decade when he heard the first engine. He thought it was thunder. The sound had that quality, low and rolling, coming from somewhere beyond the ordinary distance of traffic. He kept working the bolt. The sound got bigger. He counted involuntarily the way you count in a storm. 5, 10. He stopped being able to count individual engines somewhere around 15 because by then the sound had become a single continuous thing, a physical presence in the air of the shop, moving through the walls and the floor and up through the creeper into his back. He rolled out from under the truck. Walt was standing at the edge of the parts desk with his wrench still in his hand, looking toward the bay door with an expression Caleb had never seen on his face before. Walt Briggs had been in this shop for 31 years. He had seen things come and go on Maple Street. He was not a man who was easily moved to stillness. He was still now. "What is that?" Caleb said. Walt didn't answer. They walked out to the open bay door together and stood in the sunlight, and the sound became everything. They came around the corner off Elm, two abreast, filling the street from curb to curb, the way a river fills a channel, unhurried, precise, with the quiet authority of a thing that knows its own weight and is not in a hurry to prove it to anyone. Caleb counted to 20 and stopped because counting felt inadequate. 40, maybe more. Custom builds and newer machines mixed together, chrome and black and deep jewel colors, white hair under helmets, the iron circle patch on every back. And in the middle of all of it, an order and a purposefulness that made the whole block go still. Traffic had stopped in both directions. A woman came out of the deli on the far side of the street with a paper bag in her hand and stood on the sidewalk looking. Two kids appeared from behind the laundromat. Mrs. Aldridge was on her stoop with her cane, and Caleb saw her put her hand over her mouth. The motorcycles pulled along the curb in front of Briggs' auto and idled together, a sound like controlled weather, and then one by one the engines cut. The silence came down like something dropped from a height. Walt made a sound in his throat that did not form into a word. One bike rolled forward from the front of the line. Cherry red. The tank catching the afternoon sun the way it had caught it in a parking lot and in a photograph for 3 years. Raymond Hargrove swung his leg over the seat and dismounted and pulled his helmet off and tucked it under his arm. Behind him, 40-some men stood by their bikes with helmets in their hands, not at attention exactly, but with the stillness of people who have chosen to be exactly where they are and mean it. Walt's voice dropped to almost nothing. He said a name. Caleb. Yeah, Caleb. That's Iron Ray Hargrove. Caleb didn't say anything. Some part of him had known. Not intellectually, not with certainty, but in the way you know a thing that is too large to look at directly at an angle in your peripheral vision for days. He heard it then from the corner of the block. An engine of a different kind. A small one, practical, a car that had been reliable for a long time through regular maintenance and careful use. A Toyota Corolla, pale silver, came around the corner and pulled over at the curb a half block down. The door opened. Dorothea Merritt got out. She was wearing her good blue dress and her white cardigan and her church shoes, and she leaned against the car door for a moment to get her balance on the uneven pavement. She had not been told specifically what was happening. Mrs. Aldridge had called her 20 minutes ago and said Caleb's on Maple Street, and there are a lot of motorcycles, and I thought you should know. And Dot had called the neighbor's son for a ride without asking a single question, because there was only one thing she needed to know, which was where her grandson was. She looked at the motorcycles. She looked at the men standing by them. She looked for Caleb the way you look for something you need to find, without panic, systematically starting from the most likely place. She found him. She walked through the parted crowd on the sidewalk without acknowledging the crowd, with her chin level and her pace deliberate, and she came to stand beside her grandson, and she took his hand and held it once firmly and then kept holding it. She did not ask what was happening. She was here. That was the answer to the question she had come to answer. Hargrove stopped 6 feet in front of Caleb. He looked at him the way he had looked at him in the parking lot. That same weighted inventory, taking in the whole of a person rather than just their surface. Then he looked at Walt and gave him a small acknowledging nod. Walt Briggs. Yes, sir. I've heard of your shop for a long time. You've done right by this young man. Walt's mouth moved. Nothing came out. He nodded once and swallowed and looked at the ground. Hargrove turned back to Caleb. You feeling all right today, son? Yes, sir. Arm healing. Hargrove nodded once. Then he turned to face the street and raised his voice, not loud, but with a caring quality, the voice of a man who had spent decades making himself heard in large spaces without ever needing to shout. I owe this young man an introduction. My name is Raymond Hargrove. Most people call me Ray. Some people call me Iron Ray. I founded Hargrove Custom Works in 1995, and I have served as president of the Iron Circle chapter for 25 years. He paused. Down the block, Caleb could see Delia Vance from the local news standing beside her camera operator, not running, not shouting, just recording. That's the reason Hargrove continued that the clerk at the Sunoco station on 5th Street locked the door from the inside instead of calling the police when 6 men put me on the ground. He didn't need the police. He knew who to call. In this chapter, we have one rule above every other rule. We don't forget. We don't forget who stood up. We don't forget who went quiet. We don't forget who looked the other way. And we do not forget who ran in when nobody else did. He turned back to Caleb. Last week, a young man with a bruised arm and a wrench in his back pocket ran in. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask what was in it for him. He ran in because it was the right thing and because nobody else was going to. He looked at the camera for a moment, then back at Caleb. That's the kind of person I have spent my entire life looking for and almost never found. The street was absolutely quiet. Even the traffic at the far end of the block seemed to have understood that this was not the moment for ordinary sound. Dot's hand tightened around Caleb's. He felt it and he looked at her, and she was looking at Hargrove with her chin up and her eyes bright, and he could see in her face the exact expression she wore when something was happening that confirmed what she had always believed, which was not surprise but a kind of deep bone-level recognition. Hargrove looked at her. He took his helmet from under his arm and held it against his chest. He gave her a single unhurried nod, a gesture from an older vocabulary, the kind of respect that doesn't need explaining. Ma'am, she nodded back. She held her grandson's hand. Hargrove turned to Caleb. Come to the shop tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Bring her with you. We've got business to discuss. Yes, sir. Hargrove put one hand on Caleb's good shoulder. The compass ring caught the late afternoon light. Then he turned and swung back over the panhead and settled his helmet, and the engine came alive underneath him with that sound that Caleb felt in his chest and his feet and somewhere deeper than either. 43 engines started together. The block shook. Nobody on Maple Street forgot that sound for the rest of their lives. Hargrove Custom Works occupied a converted warehouse on the industrial edge of the east side, a building that had once made refrigerator components and now made the finest custom motorcycles in the state. 15,000 square feet of polished concrete and exposed brick, and the smell of machine oil and lacquer, and something underneath both of those things, something harder to name. The smell of work done over time, of skill accumulated in a place, of a craft that had been practiced in these walls long enough to leave its mark on the air itself. Caleb had only ever seen these machines in photographs. He kept his hands at his sides, and he kept walking. Hargrove led them through the showroom floor without stopping past a 1948 knucklehead that Caleb recognized from a magazine piece he'd read twice, past a wall of framed photographs that he wanted to stop and study, and did not, through a heavy wooden door into a back room with a long table and leather chairs and a wall behind the main seat covered floor to ceiling in the documented history of what this shop had built and what the men who built it had meant to each other. He pulled out a chair for Dot. He sat across from her. He put a folder on the table between them. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Dot. He folded his hands. Two things this morning. Then we talk. Dot nodded once. She had her purse in her lap and her back straight and her eyes level, and she looked exactly as comfortable in this room as she looked at her own kitchen table, which was to say entirely. The first is for you, ma'am. He opened the folder. He slid a single page across the table. Yesterday, I had my people pull every medical bill in your name from the last 18 months. All of it, the specialist visits, the lab work, the prescriptions, the hospital copays. We are paying every one of them in full today, by end of business. Dot's hand went to her purse. Going forward, your insulin, your testing supplies, your monitoring equipment, your doctor visits, all of it will be covered by the chapter's medical fund. We maintain this fund for our own people. As of this morning, you are one of our own. Dot looked at the page. She looked at the number at the bottom. She looked at Hargrove. She said, Mr. Hargrove, may I speak? Please. I appreciate what you've said. I appreciate it more than I can express in this room. But I have to tell you something about this family that you need to understand before we go any further. She set her purse on the table in front of her and folded her hands on top of it. We don't take gifts we can't repay. We have never taken charity. Not from the church, not from the city, not from neighbors, not from anyone who offered it without expecting something in return. My grandson's great-grandfather worked a farm in Georgia for 30 years and never once took a thing he hadn't earned. And every person in this family since then has lived by the same principle. It is not pride, Mr. Hargrove. It is identity. She paused. So if you want to help us, you need to give me a way to earn what you're offering. I can still work. I can answer a telephone. I can keep books. I can greet every person who walks through a door and make them feel that someone is glad they came. Find me something. The room was quiet. Hargrove looked at her for a long time. Caleb watched his face go through something that wasn't quite surprise, because Hargrove seemed like a man who had trained himself past surprise over many years, but was related to it. A recalibration. The expression of someone who had expected resistance and had not expected this particular kind. Something moved across his face. A small thing. Something close to a smile and something earned. Ma'am, he said, I had a feeling you were going to say something like that. Did you? I did. He leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he tapped the table once with the compass ring. The steel made a small, clean sound on the wood. Here's my counter. When your grandson opens a community garage on the east side, and he will open one, I want you at the front counter every morning. Full wages, not a courtesy rate, full wages. You greet every customer who walks through the door. You run the books. You set the tone of the place. Without you sitting there's no shop, that's the deal. Dot did not pause. Then we agree. She put her hand out across the table. Hargrove shook it. Then he turned to Caleb, and the second thing was simpler and harder at the same time. A paid apprenticeship at this shop. 5 days a week beginning Monday. He would start at the bottom, cleaning bays, prepping parts, doing whatever the lead builders needed done before they needed to ask for it. The pay was a living wage, not generous, but real. The hours would be long. He would learn the trade from the men who had built it from the ground up. That was the whole of the offer. Caleb waited for more. There wasn't more. He said, "That's it." "That's it," Hargrove said. "No scholarship, no gift, no shortcut." He leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me carefully, son. This is not a reward for what happened last week. The reward for last week was the bandana I tied on your arm. We're square on that. What I'm offering you now is an investment. I invest in people, not in stories. I don't give anything for free. I give opportunity. What you do with the opportunity, the school, the build, the shop of your own, that's up to you. You earn it the way I had to earn mine. Starting Monday morning at 6 o'clock. Caleb looked at the folder. He looked at his grandmother. He looked at Hargrove. He said, "Yes, sir." Hargrove slid the apprenticeship contract across the table. Caleb read every line. He read it twice. He picked up the pen and signed his name at the bottom in his careful, deliberate handwriting. Caleb Merritt. Dot put her hand on his shoulder and watched every letter. The first weeks were not what he had imagined. He had not exactly imagined anything specific, but whatever had existed as a general shape in the back of his mind, some sense of immediate entrance into the world of the work he had always wanted to do, it was not what Monday morning looked like. Monday morning looked like a mop. He cleaned bays for the first 3 days. He ran parts from the shelf to the bench and back again for the first week. The lead builder, a man named Croft, who had been at Hargrove Custom Works for 11 years and communicated with the economy of someone who believed language was a resource to be conserved, called him the kid for the first 2 weeks. Not unkindly, just accurately in the way that things are named for what they are until they become something else. Caleb did not complain. He showed up before 6 every morning, and he stayed past 5 every afternoon, and he watched everything and asked questions only when the alternative was making an avoidable mistake. He learned the rhythms of the shop the way you learn the rhythms of any organism you've decided to become part of, by paying attention to what happened before and after every action, what caused what each sound meant. He carried his adjustable wrench in his back pocket every day. Nobody commented on it. The arm healed. By the end of the second week, the bruise had gone from purple to yellow, and by the third week, it was gone entirely, and what remained was only the memory of the bandana folded carefully on Dot's kitchen table, which she had moved to the windowsill above the sink, where it sat in the morning light next to her small cactus, and the photograph of Caleb's mother when she was young. He started trade school in September. Tuesday and Thursday nights, 2.5 hours each, a classroom on the 3rd floor of the Technical College on Grant Avenue. He was the youngest person in his cohort by 4 years, and one of 3 people who showed up with grease still on their hands from work that had ended an hour before class. The instructor was a retired fleet mechanic named Aldous Pemberton, who wore short-sleeve shirts regardless of season and graded on precision rather than enthusiasm, which Caleb found deeply comfortable. He rode with Walt sometimes in the mornings before the shop opened and the light was low and the streets were quiet. Walt was quiet on those drives the way he was quiet everywhere, purposefully, as if silence were a tool he'd learned to use well. But one morning in October, stopped at a red light on Clement, Walt looked out the windshield and said without preamble, "I called in every favor I had to get you that first interview at my shop 3 years ago. Nobody was going to take a 15-year-old kid on. I knew they weren't." Caleb looked at him. Walt kept looking at the light. "Didn't tell you that then because you didn't need to know it then. Telling you now because you should know somebody saw you before any of this. Before Hargrove, before the parking lot. Somebody already knew what you were. The light changed. Walt drove. Caleb didn't say anything. He sat with it the way you sit with things that are too large to respond to immediately, that need to be carried for a while before they can be fully understood. In October, Croft stopped calling him the kid. He didn't announce it. He just started using Caleb's name instead, in the same economical way he used all words, as if the name had simply become the accurate term, and the other one was no longer needed. The other builders followed without comment. That was the whole of the promotion. It was enough. He was cleaning the intake of a late-model Sportster in early November alone in the back of the shop at 4:30 in the afternoon when he made the mistake. It was a small thing in the taxonomy of shop errors. He over-torqued a fitting on a rare aluminum intake manifold, a part that had been sourced from a single supplier in Ohio and had a lead time of 6 weeks. He felt it go, the specific sensation of a thread stripping under load, the sudden absence of resistance that means you have gone past the point of what the material was designed to hold. He sat very still for a moment. He looked at the fitting. He looked at his hands. He finished the day. He documented the error on the job sheet in his careful handwriting, including the cause and his assessment of the repair options, the same way he would document anything. Then he drove home and sat at the kitchen table with Dot while she ate dinner, and he could not eat. And he looked at the stack of paid medical receipts she kept in the kitchen drawer, now paid in full by end of business. And he felt something that was not guilt exactly. It was heavier than guilt. It was the weight of being given something you are not yet certain you are equal to. He lay in bed that night and did not sleep. He was in the shop at 5:30 the next morning. He sat on the parts crate in the back with his jacket still on and waited. Hargrove came in at 7. He went to his office. He came out 12 minutes later and walked to the back of the shop and stood in front of Caleb and looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come in." Caleb followed him to the office. He sat in the chair across the desk and looked at Hargrove's face and prepared himself for what was coming. Hargrove opened the desk drawer. He put something on the desk between them. It was the invoice for the intake manifold. At the bottom in handwriting, Caleb didn't recognize someone had written a single line and initialed it. The invoice had been marked paid. Caleb looked at it. He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove said, "I had that paid this morning before you got here." He leaned back in his chair. "When I was 23 years old, I was apprenticing under a man named Whitmore in a shop outside Reno. 3rd month in, I over-torqued a fitting on a 46 knucklehead he'd been building for 8 months. He came in the next morning and found my error report on the bench, and he called me into the office, and I sat exactly where you're sitting now, and I thought it was over." He was quiet for a moment. He paid it. He didn't say a word about the cost. He looked at me and he said, "Everyone breaks something their first year. The ones who write it down and come back the next morning are the ones I keep." He looked at Caleb across the desk. "You wrote it down, you came back. That's not nothing. That's actually most of it." Caleb sat with that. He felt something shift in his chest. Not relief, exactly, relief was too light a word. Something with more weight to it. The feeling of being seen accurately without reduction and found adequate. He said, "Thank you." Hargrove shook his head once. "Don't thank me. Go make it matter." The chapter showed up on a Saturday morning in early December with a truck full of lumber, a generator, 3 nail guns, and enough coffee to supply a moderate-sized office building. Walt Briggs came. Bishop Crane came with 2 other senior members. 4 of the newer builders from the shop came because Croft had apparently mentioned it, and they had apparently decided to come without being asked. Dot was on the porch in a folding chair by 7 o'clock. She had a glass of sweet tea in her notebook, and she did not go inside. She supervised everything. She knew the name of every man on her roof by noon, and she called them by name without error for the rest of the day and the days that followed. New roof, new insulation, a proper threshold on the front door that sealed against the weather, an accessibility ramp from the sidewalk to the porch built to grade with a smooth surface and a rail on both sides. New cabinets in the kitchen lower than the old one's position so she could reach every shelf without bending. a drawer beside the stove for the testing kit and the notebook. Hargrove came on the second Saturday alone in a flannel shirt. No vest, no patches, no insignia. Just a man with a compass ring on his right hand and a cup of coffee he'd brought from somewhere, and a willingness to spend a Saturday afternoon helping frame a wall. Caleb worked beside him for 2 hours without saying much. Then between cuts he said, "Can I ask you something?" Hargrove said, "Probably." "That night at the shop, the paperwork. Why did you have it ready before we even walked in?" Hargrove looked at the stud he was marking. He made the mark and set the pencil down. "Because I had already decided." He picked up the pencil again. "I didn't need the meeting to decide. I needed the meeting for you and your grandmother to decide. That's different." Caleb thought about that for a moment. Then he went back to work. Decker Pruitt did not come to Caleb in these months. He was not in the story the way he would later become part of it. He was somewhere else entirely, living in the aftermath of a Tuesday afternoon that had gone wrong in ways he had not anticipated, ways that had left him with a wrist that ached when the weather changed, and a memory he couldn't quite drink far enough down to stop returning. He had lost the group within a month. Not dramatically, just the way things dissolve when the center of them is no longer interesting, which Decker had stopped being after a parking lot in July, when he had run from a 60-year-old man and an 18-year-old kid with a bicycle chain, and the word had gotten around in the way that words always got around. He was in a smaller place now. He slept on a cousin's couch. He worked short stints at a car wash that paid just enough to eat on and not enough for anything else. He was 30 pounds lighter than he had been in July, and none of that weight had left him in a healthy way. One evening in December, he drove to the cemetery on the east side of town. He parked at the gate and walked to the section in the back where the older stones were the ones that didn't have flowers in front of them anymore, because the people who would have brought flowers were also gone. He found the stone he was looking for and sat down in the dead grass in front of it. His father's name was on the stone. His father had been 41 years old when he died, and Decker had been 9, and in the years between then and now, he had spent a significant amount of effort not thinking about what his life might have looked like if there had been someone in it who stayed. He sat there for a long time in the cold. He didn't know sitting there that 3 blocks away, Caleb Merritt was at the kitchen table with his grandmother, spelling out the first draft of a business plan for a community garage on the east side that would eventually employ 6 people, including, though neither of them could have imagined it, yet Decker Pruitt himself. He just sat with his father's name cut in stone, and the December air moving through the cemetery, and the weight of everything he had become since he was 9 years old, and he did not cry. He was beyond the kind of crying that needed an audience, even an internal one. He sat there until his legs were stiff from the cold ground. Then he got up and walked back to his car and drove away. The business plan took 8 weeks. Caleb worked on it at the kitchen table every night after his shift and every weekend morning before the shop opened. Dot helped him with the financial projections. She understood better than he did, because Dot had spent 40 years managing a household on income that required precision, and she understood numbers the way mechanics understand tolerances intimately without illusion. He did not know what he was doing at first. He had never written a business plan. He read 3 books about it from the library and applied what made sense and ignored what didn't, and wrote the whole thing in his careful, deliberate handwriting before he typed it. Community garage, east side location, 6 bays, 2 lifts, a front desk, a tool library that residents could borrow from, apprenticeship program for young people from the neighborhood, sliding scale pricing so that the people who lived closest to the shop could afford to use it. He typed the final version at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in January. Dot read it over his shoulder without saying anything. When he got to the last page, she put her hand on his shoulder once briefly and went to bed. He submitted it to Hargrove the next morning. He left it on the desk in the office and went to work. That afternoon at 4:15, Hargrove opened the office door and looked across the shop floor at Caleb. He said, "Come in here." Caleb walked to the office. He stood in the doorway. Hargrove was holding the document. He had read it. There were marks on several pages in his handwriting, questions and comments in the margins, the marks of someone who had read something seriously and engaged with it rather than just reviewed it. He set it down. He said, "Sit down." Caleb sat. Hargrove looked at him across the desk. "There are three things in here that need work. The liability section is thin and your insurance estimates are low. Your labor rate in the sliding scale section will lose money at full volume. And you need a clause about the apprenticeship program's minimum age." Caleb nodded. He had a pen. He wrote all three things down. Hargrove watched him write. Then he said, "I'll have the lawyers look at it next week. If the revisions are solid, we break ground in the spring." Caleb looked up from his notepad. Hargrove met his eyes across the desk. "Go fix those three things," he said. "Then come back." Caleb stood up. He went back to work. That night driving home, he thought about the months between this moment and the moment in a parking lot on 5th Street when a man had said, "We don't forget," and kicked his motorcycle to life and rolled out of sight. He thought about everything that had happened in those months and what each piece of it had cost and what each piece of it had built. And he thought about his grandmother at the kitchen table with a pen and a calculator and a business plan for a garage neither of them had been able to imagine in July. And he thought about a library book on a parts crate and a name and a caption he had whispered to himself on quiet afternoons for 3 years. He thought about Hargrove's voice, low and even across the desk. "Go fix those three things, then come back." He fixed them over the weekend. He brought the revised document in Monday morning. He set it on the desk. He went to work. He did not know that by the time he was under the first truck of the morning, Hargrove had already picked up the phone and called his lawyer. He did not know that by noon the papers were already in motion. He just kept working the way he had always kept working, with his hands and his attention and the small adjustable wrench in his back pocket, moving in the direction of something he could not yet fully see, but had spent long enough moving toward that he had learned to trust the direction even when the destination was still out of sight. The morning they opened the garage, there was snow. Not a storm, not the kind that shuts a city down and gives people a reason to stay inside and feel justified about it. Just a light, steady fall, the kind that comes in February in the early hours and covers everything in an inch of quiet white before the day begins and the traffic moves through it and turns it to gray. It covered the new sign above the door. It covered the accessibility ramp that 8 men had built on a December Saturday. It covered the sidewalk that Caleb had been out shoveling since 5 in the morning, alone in the dark, with his breath fogging in the cold air and his boots leaving the only prints on the block. Merritt and Hargrove Community Garage. The letters were cut from brushed steel and mounted flush against the brick above the bay doors, and even under the snow, they caught what little light there was and held it. Caleb had chosen the name himself. He had stood in front of a blank page for 20 minutes before he wrote it, and when he wrote it, he wrote both names because both names were true, and because the thing he had learned in the last 12 months was that nothing he had built alone, and he was not interested in pretending otherwise. He finished shoveling the walk and stood on the curb and looked at the building. 15,000 square feet smaller than Hargrove's flagship, but larger than anything he had imagined in July. 6 bays, 2 lifts, a front desk made from a piece of reclaimed oak that Walt Briggs had brought in his truck one Saturday in January and installed himself without being asked. A tool library along the east wall. 63 tools on open pegboard racks available for any neighborhood resident to borrow for 24 hours at no cost. Because Caleb had spent enough years not being able to afford the right tool for a job to know exactly what that cost a person. He went inside and started the heat. Dot arrived at 7:30. She came in the passenger side of Mrs. Aldridge's daughter's car, which was the arrangement they had worked out because Dot's driving had become a point of quiet negotiation between them in the fall, and Dot had agreed to be driven under the condition that she was never made to feel driven, which Mrs. Aldridge's daughter had apparently understood because she pulled up and let Dot out and drove away without making a production of either direction. Dot was wearing her good navy dress and her white cardigan. In the apron she had bought specifically for this morning, a clean dark green canvas apron with a front pocket large enough for her notebook and her pen. She stood in the doorway of the garage for a moment and looked at the front desk. She looked at the bays. She looked at the tool wall. She looked at Caleb. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she walked to the front desk and set her purse on the shelf underneath and put on the apron and took her notebook out of the front pocket and set it on the desk and took out the pen that Raymond Hargrove had given her at the end of their meeting in January. A simple thing, a good one, a pen that wrote cleanly and had weight to it and had come in a small box with nothing written on the outside. She uncapped it. She opened the notebook to the first page. She wrote the date at the top, February 11th. She wrote the day's weather in her small, precise handwriting. Light snow clearing by noon. She wrote the time, 7:41. Then she looked up and smiled at Caleb the way she smiled at things she had been waiting a long time to see. He went to check the lifts. He tested the first lift at 8:20 and it ran clean. He tested the second one at 8:25 and it ran clean. He went to the front and unlocked the bay doors and the cold February air came in. And through the open doors he could see the shoveled walk and the new sign in the street with its inch of quiet snow beginning to mark itself with the first footprints of the morning. He paused at the window and looked at Dot. Her morning numbers had been stable for months now, steadily, quietly better in the way real improvement works without drama, without announcement, accumulating in small increments that only become visible when you have enough of them to look back across. She had stopped reporting them to him 6 weeks ago, which he had learned meant they were acceptable enough that she no longer felt the need. He had stopped asking and started watching instead. The color in her face, the ease of her movement, the quality of her mornings. All three had been telling him the same thing since October. Walt arrived at 8:45 with 2 cups of coffee. He gave one to Dot without asking what she took in it, because he had apparently paid enough attention over the months to know. He stood in the middle of the floor with his cup and looked around at all of it in the way Walt Briggs looked at things that mattered to him, with the careful attention of someone who was making sure to record something properly, who understood that the moment was worth the looking. He said to nobody specifically built right. That was all. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Aldridge came through the door. She was wearing her good winter coat, and she had her cane and her grandson beside her, a boy of about 16 named Curtis, who had the look of someone who had been recruited for this errand and had agreed to it because the alternative was worse. She came to the front desk, and she looked at Dot, and she looked at the garage behind Dot, and she looked at Caleb standing in the bay door, and her face did something complicated and warm. "My alternator," she said to Dot. "It's been making a sound," Dot wrote in her notebook. She asked 3 questions in the efficient, courteous way. She asked all questions, gathering only the information she needed and making the person feel that their information was worth gathering. She told Mrs. Aldridge to have a seat in the waiting area, the 2 chairs they'd put by the front window, with a small table between them and a stack of magazines that Caleb had gotten from the library discard shelf. Curtis brought the car around to the first bay. Caleb looked at the alternator for 4 minutes. He came back in and told Mrs. Aldridge what it was, which was a worn brush set simple about 90 minutes of work. "How much?" she said. He shook his head. She started to say something. He shook his head again gently. "First customer through the door," he said. "That's just how it works today." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Dot and said something low that Caleb didn't catch, and Dot laughed, a real laugh, the kind she didn't perform. Curtis sat in the waiting area chair and looked at his phone while Caleb worked. After about 20 minutes, he put his phone away and came and stood in the bay door and watched. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Caleb handed him the old brush set at one point to hold while he positioned the new one, and Curtis held it with the careful attention of someone who was interested but didn't want to admit it yet. At 11 o'clock, Raymond Hargrove walked through the front door. He came alone. No entourage, no chapter, no formation of motorcycles. Just a man in his leather vest with a cup of coffee from the place 3 blocks over that he had apparently already located, coming through the door of a garage on the east side of town on a February morning to see what the people he had bet on had built. He stopped inside the door. He looked at the bays. He looked at the lifts. He looked at the tool wall with its 63 tools on their labeled pegs. He looked at the front desk and at Dot behind it, who looked up and gave him a nod of greeting that was professional and warm, and made it entirely clear that this was her desk and her domain, and he was welcome in it. He nodded back. He walked to the far wall. The frame was simple wood dark walnut, hung at eye level on the brick between the tool wall and the door to the back office. Inside it, behind glass, was a folded blue bandana, worn soft, clean, the kind of blue that had been washed many times and had settled into itself. Below the frame, fixed to the wall on a strip of the same dark walnut, 3 words had been carved in careful letters. Not printed, not stamped, carved by hand by Caleb with a chisel he had borrowed from the tool library at Hargrove's flagship 3 weeks ago and returned the next morning. We don't forget. Hargrove stood in front of it. He was still for a long time. Not the stillness of a man thinking, but the stillness of a man receiving something, absorbing it, letting it settle into the places where things like this settle. He raised his right hand and touched the glass once lightly with the tip of one finger. The compass ring caught the fluorescent light of the garage the way it had caught the sun in a parking lot on a July afternoon. He did not speak. He stood there for another moment. Then he lowered his hand and turned and went to find Dot at the front desk, and Caleb went back to the alternator, and the morning continued. The first week was 12 customers. The second week was 19. By the end of the first month, they had established a rhythm. Caleb and the 2 young mechanics he had hired from his trade school cohort, both of them East Side kids who had graduated 2 semesters ahead of the curve and had been looking for work that was worth doing. The shop ran on the logic Caleb had written into the business plan and revised and brought to Hargrove's desk, clean corrected ready. Dot knew every customer's name by the end of the first week. All of them. She had a system, her notebook first visit information written in the front, repeat visits in the back, so that every person who walked through the door a second time was greeted by name before they had finished saying hello. People noticed. They came back. They told other people. That was the whole of the marketing strategy, and it worked the way Dot had always worked, through the compounding effect of paying attention to people as if they mattered. Her blood sugar number stayed stable through March and into spring. Her doctor's appointment in March produced a look of cautious professional surprise that she reported to Caleb over dinner with the dry satisfaction of a woman who had been right about something and was not going to overstate it. The panhead came together through the spring and into the summer of that second year. 8 months of Tuesday and Thursday evenings at Hargrove's flagship, begun the month before the garage opened and finished in August. Caleb at the bench and Hargrove beside him, sometimes working and sometimes watching, sometimes silent for an hour, and then saying a single precise thing about angle or tension, or the patience that hand-laid pinstripe work required. The tank work took 6 sessions. Hargrove showed him the brush first, the specific single hair brush, how it was held, how the pressure was managed, how you pulled a line not by muscle, but by the relationship between your breath and your hand and the surface you were moving across. He showed him twice. Then he put the brush in Caleb's hand and stepped back. The first line was not good. The second was better. By the 4th session, something had shifted, some relationship between Caleb's hand and eye, and the surface of the tank had begun to develop an internal logic, and Hargrove, watching from the stool in the corner, made a sound that was not a word, but that Caleb had learned to read accurately. That sound meant, now you're starting to get it. One evening in April, working late, just the 2 of them in the back section of the shop. After the other builders had gone, Hargrove said the man who taught me the tank work was named Delacroix. Eugene Delacroix. He had a shop in New Mexico for 30 years. Died in 2003. He was quiet for a moment. His name is on the ring. Caleb looked up. He looked at the compass ring on Hargrove's right hand. He had looked at it many times in the last year. He had assumed the name on the bezel was a direction marker, part of the compass design. He looked now and saw that among the cardinal letters worked into the engraving, there were letters that didn't belong to compass notation. He looked back at the tank. He didn't ask anything more. Some information is given as a gift, and the right response is to receive it without picking it apart. The panhead was finished in August. Cherry red, the specific cherry red of the photograph in the book, because Caleb had matched it himself over the course of 3 evenings with a color chart and the patience of someone who understood that this was not an approximation, but a commitment. The pinstripe work on the tank was his, every line of it. Hargrove had watched the final session from the stool and said nothing until it was done, and then said Delacroix would have nodded at that, which was the highest thing Caleb had ever been told. The scholarship applications went out in September. The Merit and Hargrove Educational Fund established formally in the spring, with Hargrove's lawyers and Caleb's signature, and Dot's careful bookkeeping setting up the infrastructure. 2 awards for the first cycle. One to a young woman from the East Side named Beatrice Holloway, who wanted to study nursing and had been accepted to the program at the state university and needed the gap between her financial aid and her actual costs filled in. One to a young man from 2 streets over who had been working at a lumber yard since 17 and wanted to study civil engineering. Delia Vance called Caleb in October about a follow-up piece. He said, "I'd rather you talk to the scholarship recipients." She said, "I want to talk to you." He said, "Talk to them first. If there's anything left to say after that, call me back." She called back. She said there was something left to say. He agreed to 20 minutes, which became 40, which became the piece that ran in November and was, as Delia told her editor, the best thing she had filed in 7 years of local news. Not because of anything dramatic, because of the quality of a story that doesn't need embellishment, that is simply what it is, and trust that to be enough. Walt Briggs read the piece alone in the shop on a Tuesday morning before anyone else came in. He read it twice sitting in the office chair with his coffee cooling beside him. When he finished the second read, he folded the paper along its original creases and set it on the desk and sat for a moment with his hands folded in front of him. He didn't tell anyone he had read it. He didn't mention it to Caleb. He just went to work when the first car came in, the way he had gone to work for 31 years, with the steady application of his knowledge to the problem in front of him. But that Friday, he put a framed copy of the article on the wall of the shop between the job board and the parts catalog without explanation and left it there. Decker Pruitt came in on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November. Caleb was in the office going over the month's accounts when he heard Dot's voice at the front desk, the measured quality it took on when she was being courteous to someone she was assessing. He looked through the office window, a man at the desk, thin, considerably thinner than he had been in a jacket too light for the weather. Hands on the counter, not gripping it, just resting, but with a kind of effortfulness, as if stillness required active management. Caleb looked at him for a moment. He recognized him the way you recognize something you have been peripherally aware of for a long time without examining directly. The recognition came through the thinness and the changed posture and the fact that he was standing at a counter asking for something with his eyes slightly averted. Decker Pruitt. Caleb set down the accounts. He came out of the office. Dot looked at Caleb briefly as he came through the door, a question in her eyes. He gave her a small nod that she read correctly because she read everything correctly, and she stepped back slightly and let the moment belong to whoever it was going to belong to. Decker looked at him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Caleb looked at him without expression. Not hard, not cold, without the performance of any particular feeling, which was more difficult and more honest than either of the alternatives. He looked at the man across the counter. He saw what a different kind of year did to a person, not the dramatic transformation that announces itself. The other kind, the kind that hollows things out and doesn't fill them back in yet, and leaves a person thinner and quieter, and standing at counters with their hands on the surface, trying to look like the asking is not the hardest thing they've done in a while. Decker said, "I heard you were hiring." Caleb didn't say anything immediately. Decker said, "I'm not asking for anything except a chance to work. I can show up. I can follow instructions. I don't need much." His voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has stripped out everything that could be used against them. Caleb looked at him for another moment. Then he turned and walked to the supply closet at the back of the bay. He came back with a broom in his hand. He set it on the counter between them. "Start there," he said. Decker looked at the broom. He looked at Caleb. He did not say thank you. He did not offer anything. He picked up the broom and nodded once a short, contained thing and walked toward the front bay. He stopped. Between the tool wall and the door to the back office at eye level on the brick, the walnut frame caught the shop's fluorescent light. Behind the glass, the folded blue bandana. Below it, the carved letters. We don't forget. Decker stood in front of it for a moment. Caleb watched him from behind the counter. He saw the moment it landed. Not in Decker's posture exactly, not in anything that could be cleanly described. More in the quality of the stillness that came over him, which was different from the stillness he had walked in with. The first stillness was managed. This one was involuntary. This one was the stillness of someone who has been hit by something they weren't expecting and is standing very still while it moves through them. He stood there for 3 or 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked to the front of the first bay and began to sweep. Caleb went back to the accounts. Dot wrote something in her notebook. Decker swept the front of the shop that morning and the middle of the shop that afternoon. He was back the next morning at 7:45, 10 minutes before the shop opened without being told what time to arrive. He didn't say much to anyone. He did what was in front of him and then waited to be told what was next, and then did that. He ate lunch from a paper bag alone in the bay. Caleb watched him the way he watched most things, without commentary, with attention. By the end of the first week, Croft, who Caleb had brought over 1 day a week from Hargrove's flagship as a technical advisor and senior mechanic, had taken note of the way Decker handled tools. He had come to Caleb on Friday afternoon and said with his characteristic economy that one's not afraid of the work. Caleb said no. Croft said, where'd he come from? Caleb said a parking lot. Croft looked at him. Caleb said it doesn't matter where he came from. Watch what he does from here. Croft went back to work. He did not ask again. Decker Pruitt was still at the garage a year later. He had moved from the broom to the prep bay to basic oil changes to brake work to the kind of diagnostic thinking that you cannot teach to someone who doesn't have it but can develop in someone who does. He was not yet good. He was becoming something which was the only direction that mattered. He never spoke directly to Caleb about the parking lot. Caleb never raised it. There was nothing in the daily life of the shop that required either of them to name the thing that had brought them both here by such different roads, and so they didn't name it. They worked in the same space and they did the work, and the work was the language, and that was enough. Some things are settled not by conversation, but by the accumulation of ordinary days. The Panhead project with Hargrove had produced something Caleb hadn't fully anticipated, which was the understanding that building something by hand, really building it from frame to finish, was not a technical exercise, but a form of thinking. It taught you how you thought. It revealed where you were patient and where you weren't, where your instincts were trustworthy and where they needed supervision. It was in that sense not so much a project as a long conversation with yourself, conducted through steel and paint and the resistance of materials that didn't care what you intended, only what you did. He thought about that when he drove home sometimes. He thought about the version of himself who had cut through the Sunoco parking lot on a July afternoon because it was 3 blocks shorter, and what that person had and hadn't known about where he was going. On a Thursday evening in late September, in the second year of the garage, he was walking home the long way. He took the long way more often now, not because his feet were tired, but because the long way went past things he liked to see. The community garden on 8th that had gone in the previous spring, the bench in front of the library on Fenwick, which was where he had first gotten his library card, where the copy of Modern Custom Builders still sat on the shelf with a different set of dog ears in it from someone else's hands. He turned onto Garrison Street. He heard it from half a block away. Not the sound itself first, but the quality of the silence around it, the specific way ambient noise pulls back when something is wrong in a small immediate space. He had known that quality since he was 12. He had learned to read the texture of a street before he was all the way around the corner. He came around the side of the building. 3 of them. Older than the one they had against the brick, considerably older, 17 or 18 to his 12. The boy was small, the kind of small that at 12 hasn't finished resolving itself yet, slight and bright-eyed under glasses that had been knocked sideways on his face, so one lens was up near his eyebrow and the other was pointing at the ground. His backpack was on the gravel. Its contents were spread around him in the way things spread when they've been thrown rather than dropped. Books, 3 of them. A spiral notebook, a pencil case that had come open, pencils everywhere. One of the 3 had the boy's arm. Not violently, not yet, but with the casual grip that announces intention rather than action, the setup before the thing, the moment where the point is still the feeling of power rather than any specific outcome. Caleb walked around the corner and stopped. He stood in the alley between the building and the fence, and he looked at the three of them, and he didn't say anything. They heard him or felt him the way people feel a change in the air behind them, and they turned. The one holding the boy's arm looked at Caleb. He was 17 maybe, with the posture of someone who had been the biggest person in most of the rooms he'd been in and had built his sense of himself around that. He looked at Caleb's face. He looked at the width of Caleb's shoulders. He looked at Caleb's hands. Then he looked down, at Caleb's chest, at the name on the jacket he was wearing, the work jacket with the garage name on the left breast. Merritt and Hargrove Community Garage. He had heard that name. Everyone on the east side had heard that name. It had accumulated weight on this side of town through 2 years of being exactly what it said it was, through Dot behind the front desk, knowing every name, through the tool library that stayed open an extra hour on Thursdays, through Beatrice Holloway, who was going to be a nurse, and whose mother told the story to anyone who would listen, through the framed article on Walt's wall and the carved letters and the 43 motorcycles that had stopped traffic on Maple Street and had become in the way that certain things become part of the story a neighborhood told about itself. The 17-year-old let go of the boy's arm. He said something to the other two that Caleb didn't catch. Then he turned and walked the other direction with the purposefulness of someone who has decided that his business was elsewhere and has always believed this. The other two followed. They did not run. Running would have been a concession. They just walked, and in 30 seconds they were around the corner and gone. Caleb waited until the sound of them had fully left the space. Then he walked to where the boy was standing against the brick. The boy had not moved. He was breathing controlled now, the aftermath of something rather than the thing itself. And behind the tilted glasses, his eyes were tracking Caleb with the careful attention of someone who has just watched one threat replaced by an unknown. Caleb crouched down and began picking up the pencils. He collected them one by one from the gravel and put them back in the pencil case. He picked up the spiral notebook and checked that the pages were intact. He stacked the books. He looked at them as he stacked them. 3 books from the library, a science textbook, a math workbook, and the third one, the one on the bottom of the pile, he picked up last. He looked at the cover for a moment. Modern Custom Builders, a Visual History. He turned it over. He looked at the spine, the library sticker, the Dewey Decimal numbers in white on black, the same classification number, the same branch code from the Fenwick Avenue Library. He had read this book until the spine went soft. He had dog-eared a page and come back to it for 3 years. He had carried it in a backpack to a gas station parking lot on a July afternoon, and it had been in his mind when he turned a corner and saw a motorcycle he recognized, and a man on his knee in broken glass. He held it in his hands for a moment. Then he looked at the boy. The boy was watching him. The glasses were still sideways on his face. He hadn't fixed them. He was 12 small, with the kind of stillness that belongs to children who have learned to be very quiet and very observant in situations they can't control, which is its own kind of intelligence, not the kind anyone puts on a certificate, but real. "You like engines," Caleb said. The boy looked at the book in Caleb's hands, then at Caleb. "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet, not scared anymore, just quiet. Caleb held the book out to him. The boy took it. He fixed his glasses with his other hand, pushing them straight on his face, and he looked at Caleb with full attention, now both lenses pointing where they were supposed to point. "What's your name, Arlo?" Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and took out a business card. The same one Dot had designed in January of last year. Cream stock, the garage name and address and phone number in clean type, nothing extra. He held it out. Arlo took it with both hands. He looked at it carefully, the way you look at something when you want to make sure you have it right. "Saturday morning," Caleb said. 8 o'clock. Bring that book." Arlo looked up from the card. He looked at Caleb's face with the attention of someone checking whether a thing is real. "You mean it," he said. Caleb looked at him. "I mean it," he said. Arlo looked at the card again. He looked at the book. He put the card in his jacket pocket with the care of someone who is not going to lose something. Yes, he said. Okay. He paused. Thank you, sir. Caleb. Not sir. Arlo looked at him. Something moved in his face, a slight shift. The expression of someone filing something important under a name they intend to keep. Yes. Caleb. Arlo put the library book in his backpack and zipped it closed and put the backpack on with both straps and straightened the straps the way you straighten them when you mean to carry something properly. He looked at Caleb once more. Then he turned and walked the other direction toward the lit end of the alley where the street was. After 5 steps, he looked back. Caleb was still there. Arlo nodded once, a short contained thing, a gesture he had made up on the spot that looked like it belonged to someone older. And then he turned forward and kept walking and broke into a run after a few feet. Not the scared kind, the other kind, the kind that has something in it rather than away from it, and in a moment he was around the corner and gone. Caleb stood in the alley for a moment. He looked at where the boy had been. He looked at the gravel where the pencils had been. He looked at the corner where the 3 of them had walked away, in the corner where Arlo had gone. Then he walked out of the alley onto Garrison Street and turned south toward home. He took the route that went past the Sunoco station on 5th Street. He did this sometimes, not often, not out of any deliberate practice of return, but because the East Side had its own geometry and the most direct routes crossed certain corners, the way rivers cross certain land, not because anyone chose it, but because that's where the ground leads. The station had changed hands twice since that July 2 years ago. The current owner had painted the exterior a clean slate blue, which covered the previous owner's yellow, which had covered the years before that in accumulated layers. The windows were new. The lot had been repaved. On the wall facing 5th Street underneath the slate blue, the ghost of the old mural was still visible, if you stood at the right angle in the right light. A winged wheel, barely there the lines of it, showing through the paint the way old things show through new ones when the new coat isn't quite thick enough. A name half legible that had once said something about custom work and now said mostly time. Caleb walked past it. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not look at the wall with any particular focus because he did not need to anymore, the way you stop needing to look at something when it has become part of you, when the information it contains has been absorbed so completely that the thing itself is no longer the point. He kept walking south on 5th. Through the front window of the garage, half a block before the turn, he could see the lights still on. Dot stayed late on Thursdays to reconcile the week's books, which she had done every Thursday since the second week they were open, because Dot's relationship with accurate numbers was long-standing and personal and not subject to delegation. He could see her at the front desk. Her head was bent over the ledger. The pen in her hand was the one Hargrove had given her in the small box with nothing on the outside, and it caught the light as she wrote. She was writing in her careful, precise hand, the same hand that had written blood sugar numbers in a notebook at 5 in the morning for 3 years. The same hand that had put itself across a table in a room full of leather and chrome and shaken the hand of a man who had expected to be in charge of the conversation and discovered he wasn't. She looked up. She saw him through the window. She lifted her hand. He lifted his. He stood there on the sidewalk for a moment with the September air moving around him and the lights of the garage warm and steady through the glass, and he looked at his grandmother at her desk in the place they had built, and he thought about Saturday morning at 8 o'clock and a boy with a library book and the kind of running that has something in it. He thought about a parking lot in July and a bandana tied with practiced hands and 3 words that had arrived in him in the dark and stayed. He thought about 43 engines starting at once and the way the block had shaken with the sound of it, and a man touching glass with the tip of one finger and standing still with whatever that meant to him. He thought about a page in a library book dog-eared and returned and checked out again by different hands, carrying the same dream down different years to different people who needed it. He turned and walked the last half block home. The wrench was still in his back pocket. It had been there every day for 4 years through parking lots and shop floors and classrooms and business meetings and the quiet of a December cemetery and the sound of 43 engines and the weight of a carving chisel working 3 words into a strip of dark walnut wood. He was 20 years old. He had a wrench in his back pocket and a boy with a library book coming Saturday morning and a grandmother writing in her ledger under warm light. He was just getting started, and this time he knew exactly what that meant.